to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. Sometimes life does a great job at throwing randomness our way. And depending on what it is, it can really determine how we feel about life's little surprises. Could be a fun surprise, like seeing someone out with their pet bird sitting on their shoulder. Replace bird with almost any pet, and I'm intrigued. But I say pet, not unidentified thing, because what I don't want to see is something I can't quite place. So random, so strange, that even when describing it, I'll know that no one will feel what I felt when I saw it. Maybe we can't all relate to the authors of these stories, but we can appreciate them. And we can appreciate the fact that we just get to sit back and listen to the stories and not experience them for ourselves. So, let's get started, shall we? I'm a 25-year-old male living in Utah, and I'm curious if there's anyone with an experience similar to my own. I'm pretty sure I saw a Wendigo or a skinwalker. I know it sounds crazy. I don't actually believe in monsters, and I'm fairly skeptical when it comes to the paranormal, but this happened when I was 17 and still in high school. Our house was in a small town, and our backyard was a vast stretch of empty fields and mountains separating us from the closest civilization. My best friend Jack lived next door, and we sort of shared this backyard space. His house was built on a different street, but the small cul-de-sac ended in this field. Later, it'll be relevant to know that his road was originally meant to have more houses, but they were never built. This meant that Jack's driveway was the only one in the cul-de-sac. At that age, I didn't have the best relationship with my parents, so I stayed at Jack's house a lot. A couple times a month, we would wake up to some weird gurgling and dragging sounds from the back porch. His room was in the basement, and the back porch could be seen through his window. But whenever we'd gather enough courage to check, nothing was there. This went on for years, but one night still haunts us to this day. It was around the time Jack was getting ready to move. We used to stay up all night playing games or watching movies, but on this night, we decided to drive around and listen to music. We hopped in his truck, switched on the high beams, and turned down the field as we drove onto the roundabout. That's when the lights illuminated this thing. It looked like a person, but it wasn't. It was naked, on all fours, abnormally large, particularly its limbs. They seemed to fold beneath the creature. Its pale skin was stretched tight over its frame, but the face is what still sends shivers down my spine. Its black eyes glistened as it stared at us, and its jaw hung open to reveal a gaping black maw, like a snake preparing to eat. Then, it suddenly began to scurry backwards into the brush, almost like a movie on rewind. My friend and I were pale as ghosts as we stared at each other in shock, disbelief. We tried to enjoy the rest of the night, but we couldn't believe what we saw. Instead, we stayed in his basement, guns ready, just in case we heard the gargling and dragging sounds again. But we never did. I'm sorry the end isn't more exciting, but it's the truth. I don't live in that town anymore, but sometimes I stop by for a visit. That empty field still feels like it's watching and waiting. Even though I can't see it, I still feel like it's out there. I think I have a ghost in my attic, and I'm not sure what else to do. I've tried burning sage, and though I'm not religious, I am desperate. My friend found a priest willing to bless the place, but that only made things worse. When I moved in, things were normal for the first 6 months. The houses in my neighborhood were built in the 50s, and so far as I'm aware, no gruesome murders were ever committed there. They have to disclose that stuff, right? I should really Google that. Anyway, I tried asking a few neighbors about the house, but the previous owners were known for keeping to themselves. Though, judging by the way some people hurried off, there may be more to it. I've just never been much of a conversationalist, unless you're a hot girl. Oh, but back to the ghost stuff. The first incident happened last September. It was late on a Saturday night. I was watching TV in bed when clear, distinct footsteps began walking across the attic. They paced from end to end before stopping directly above my head, and I hurried out as quietly as possible. Convinced someone was inside, I ran into the street while calling 911, and officers were soon searching for an intruder. Unfortunately, more like tragically, there was no sign of anyone having been in there. The cameras didn't catch anyone coming or going. There isn't enough space for someone to hide in the attic, let alone stay there. Needless to say, I looked like a fool. One of the officers suggested I had a nightmare, as if 40 isn't old enough to distinguish a dream from reality. Though, after a week passed without further incident, I admittedly began to wonder. Everything was completely normal. I even went into the attic on occasion just to reassure myself of its emptiness. The only logical conclusion was that I hallucinated the entire episode. If not, then someone left without notice by myself or the cameras. I genuinely can't decide which is more likely or preferable. That's when the second incident occurred, again while I was in bed. The footsteps resumed their pacing, but they weren't overly loud or fast. It was almost like having an inconsiderate roommate, and that's how I tried to see it. How else could I cling to my sanity? I stared at my phone, cowering beneath the covers as I waited for the footsteps to cease. I didn't dare try 911 again, either, nor did I have the courage to look in the attic myself. 3 minutes ticked by like 3 hours before the footsteps finally stopped, again, directly above my head, and remained still for the night. The sound of my pounding heart filled the void for several minutes before the room fell into complete silence. That made for another sleepless night. I was officially becoming sleepless in Seattle. Most of you are probably too young for that joke, but like I said, at a certain point you just gotta take your jollies where you can. Part of me knew the excitement was finished for the night, but I stayed on edge all the time. Logic and reason play no part in what we fear or how we respond to it. In the end, we're merely helpless puppets at the mercy of our emotional whims. We can practice moderation, but control is a lofty goal indeed. The next morning, my brother came to check the house with me again. There were only a few boxes in the attic, so we moved them to the spare room, just to really see everything at once. There was absolutely no place to hide. I can add pictures later, but it's a small space. A few days later, the footsteps returned for the third time, only they seemed to be moving slightly faster than before. Rather than hiding beneath the covers, I retreated to the den, where I remained wide awake for yet another sleepless night. The following evening is when I burned sage, but the footsteps were back 3 days later. They were definitely walking faster and louder. If I had to describe the ghost's mood, I would have said indifferent just in the beginning, but now it seemed annoyed, and that scared me. If this thing could have moods, what would it be like when angry? Well, finding out was a short wait. I must have listened to those footsteps march across the attic for 20 minutes. before screaming like a girl at a sudden series of loud thuds. It took a moment to understand where it came from. The attic access door, the usual pull-down kind with the built-in steps, was being pushed open, just hard enough to pop it back into place. It only happened a few times, and when it stopped, so did the footsteps. I was almost numb to the idea of living with a ghost, but the terror of thinking I might see it, well, that's enough to change a man. I would have invited the Pope himself if I had the clout. But I was barely able to get a local priest. Even that only happened because my friend is luckily, coincidentally, a devout Catholic. Which, believe me, I never thought I would classify that as lucky. The priest was here 2 days ago, and my meager reserves of self-restraint were utterly depleted by the end of his visit. I called him the holy man, and it definitely got us off on the wrong foot. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if he intentionally made things worse, simply out of spite. I was only being friendly. There was a priest in my house, for fuck's sake. Life just can't prepare us for certain things, so we cope how we can in the moment. Sue me. Actually, now that I do think about it, each room took him a little less time. That bastard was definitely rushing the process. If I have a total meltdown over this mess, I'm paying him a little visit before they haul me off to the loony bin. Anyway, an hour after he left is when everything truly went to hell. Before the probably fake blessing, the incidents only occurred for short periods and only late at night. But this one happened just after the sun began to set. The footsteps suddenly thundered across the attic, so hard that I could hear it downstairs in the kitchen. It sounded as if a very large man was running at full speed, stomping as loudly as possible. I was frozen in place, unable to draw a breath. I kept hoping if I stayed very still and very quiet, everything would just stop. Instead, it got worse. Without missing a step, the attic door joined in the chaos as it repeatedly banged open and closed. But that's not what shook me from my stupor. That didn't happen until I heard a different kind of thud. One I instantly recognized as the sound of a fold-out ladder slamming onto the floor. I didn't need to see confirmation. I'd made the sound myself enough times to be sure. Then, everything stopped. The house was left in complete silence. Minus my ragged breathing, obviously, but I didn't trust quiet. I've seen too many horror movies to go look behind door number 1. Without hesitating, I grabbed my keys and got the hell out of there. Since that night, I've been sleeping at my brother's, but his wife is at her limit. That's why he and I are back at the house this evening. I'm not sure what he thinks he can do to help, but it's nice just to be in my own bed again. I don't think anything will happen while he's here, but I almost hope it does. I'm sick of everyone looking at me like I'm crazy. Even having a real witness would be a huge relief at this point. Regardless, I don't think it's going to end anytime soon. All I can do is wait and see. I'll be back with an update when I have more to share. Thanks for listening. This happened a while back, but it stuck with me like it happened yesterday. My buddies and I had been out drinking, and since I was too drunk to drive, I ended up crashing at my friend's house. It was between 3 and 4 a.m. Everyone had gone to bed while I was nodding off on my friend's couch. But then, I heard a light tap on the door. I got up to try to see outside, and I heard it again. I looked into the peephole and I saw 2 small kids dressed in ragged clothes. Convinced I was just seeing things, I looked at my friend's security monitor. I I could still see them. I was about to open the door when one of the kids looked up at the camera, almost like they could see me, and my blood ran cold. The kid's eyes were gone. Where the whites of his eyes should have been, there was only blackness. He mumbled something like, "Can I come in?" Believing they hadn't seen me, I went back to the couch and listened to that faint tapping while I continued watching the monitor. I guess I eventually dozed off. When my friend woke me, I explained what happened, but he was convinced it was a hallucination. He lived in a rural area. His closest neighbor was over a mile away, so there was no reason for kids to be out that late. I thought the same thing, but I knew what I saw, and I told him to check the cameras. He also went to do so. The camera facing the back door just so happened to cut off, but the other camera showed a clear view of me looking at the monitor in astonishment. I know what I saw that night, and after doing a little research, I'm glad I didn't open the door. I'm not one to believe in things like black-eyed children, but I know what I saw. I've had several requests for more stories about my time doing trauma scene work. If you don't know what that is, I used to lead a crew that would go in after any manner of traumatic or deadly incident, one that would cause damage to the structure that the victim's family shouldn't have to see. Now, I know my stories are not scary in the traditional sense, but most people simply couldn't handle walking into these types of scenes. We had to be cautious with how we trained crew members. It was often done on a volunteer basis, meaning we didn't force anyone to go into a house where a father killed his children before killing himself on a lazy boy. We just didn't start someone in training and then go, "Oh, by the way, we're going to do a multiple homicide." Anyway, if there was a way to describe the sights or smells associated with doing this type of work, I'm sure you would see how truly terrifying this is. First off, I have to say that suicide is not glamorous, nor does it ever end for those around you. If you need help, please get help. Don't let your loved ones find you that way. It not only changes them, but it changes the feelings inside the house. Well, back to my story. This took place in the late 90s. Just before I left the field, we dispatched a crew to a house where we were told an incident with at least one death had occurred. Sometimes it's given to us that way. It's never the whole story. But sometimes we learned what happened on the evening news or through a chatty neighbor. We arrived at a modest house. It wasn't really a high-end home, but not a low-end either. It was 2 stories and about midway down the cul-de-sac. As with some scenes, there was a cluster of neighbors looking to see who we were and why we were there. The sheriff's department had just released the scene, so all of the crime scene investigators had already done their job. As I approached the house, I noticed a ton of what appeared to be bullet holes in the stucco, broken glass, and a long blood stain on the driveway. We went inside, and we had to suit up almost immediately, as the police had probably used tear gas. There were bloodstains everywhere. It looked like someone was dragged through the house with blood gushing. There was an area where it pooled. There were areas where it looked like mini explosions had occurred, which I assume was by flashbangs, or maybe the guy inside had shot up. What probably strikes you the most in situations like this is how benign the underneath looks. I don't know how to describe it, but just imagine the set of Full House. Now imagine their TV with bullet holes, surrounded by tons of broken glass and pooled blood. I mean, they seemed like a normal family. There was a big, blue wooden sign that said family in the living room, and underneath it were a bunch of family photos, pictures of kids, parents, Christmas gatherings, graduations, vacations. There was also a wall dedicated to the dad's favorite sports teams and pictures of him with friends at games. So, what happened? According to the news reports, the neighbors, and from what we saw at the scene, the dad went crazy. He'd been talking about demons, and not in a I've got my own demons kind of way, but actual demons. He was positive that he was being attacked by the devil, that the demons were trying to take his family's souls. Rather than let the demons take their souls, he killed them so they could go to heaven. He ended up barricading himself in the house. It looked like some of the family members tried to get away after being wounded, but one collapsed in the kitchen. One somehow escaped, and one was brought out by the police. He ended up shooting back at the police, and several blocks were evacuated. I'm not sure about that part. We arrived much later, but that's what people said. In the end, the dad found his way onto the roof, still shooting at the officers, until they shot him down. It was his blood that we'd cleaned from the driveway. He murdered his wife. One of his children died in the hospital. One child was killed inside the house. One escaped. And another family member was not home when the attack occurred. It took a lot longer to clean this scene as there were so many holes. And we had to remove almost all of the carpet and soft surfaces due to the tear gas. It was a terrible scene. I know this might sound religious or whatever, but after seeing enough of those scenes, you really start to believe evil exists. When I was 15 or 16, my family and I were driving along the interstate on our way to a beach in San Diego. I was listening to music, looking out at the clouds, when I noticed a weird, black, triangular object in the sky. It was difficult to keep track of, but I originally thought that it must be a plane. You don't hear about many UFO sightings happening in the middle of the day. And then I noticed how odd it was moving. The tip was pointing down towards the earth, and it was slowly moving closer to the ground. I was still trying to convince myself that it was a plane or weather balloon, but planes don't usually fly downwards. As we continued driving, the clouds moved across the sky, and I lost it for a few minutes. I thought that that was the end of it, but I finally spotted it again, except now it was dropping faster. Only then did I think to alert my family of this weird object. But it very abruptly stopped its descent and shot back into the sky at lightning speed. I never saw it again. Afterwards, I frantically tried to tell my family what I saw. My father pointed to a small fleet of jets shooting across the sky. It seemed weird at the time, but I didn't think much of it. Still, to this day, I don't really know what I saw. As a child, my mom and I lived on the first floor of an old house that was divided into 4 apartments. It was near a mortuary, and we had many strange encounters with someone or something for the entire 20 years we lived there. I want to tell my stories, beginning with the one that may not be the scariest, but it still gives me headaches to this day. I'm female, and in my teen years, I still slept in the canopy bed my grandpa built when I was 4 or 5. I once went to a dollar store, and I found a unique dream catcher that fit perfectly between the curtains. It had a star macrame in dark purple, and instead of feathers, there was some kind of wind chime under the web. It was beautiful, and I loved the sound it made every time I got in or out of bed. One day, When I came home, I immediately noticed my dream catcher was gone. Only the ring and a piece of purple fabric hung between the curtains. The rest of its pieces were strewn all over my room. The chime was ripped apart, and the macrame was completely torn. It looked like a cat had itself a delightful time, but we didn't own a cat. It felt like a crime scene, and it gave me chills. Later that day, I did some research on the macrame star pattern, only to find that the symbol itself is meant to drive away dark spirits. Maybe this dream catcher saved us in a way that I've never noticed. I have no other explanation for this experience, but I'd love to hear similar stories. It was 4 a.m. when I woke to someone knocking at my door, but when I opened it, no one was there. I knocked on the bathroom door and my mom said to give her a minute. She was just getting my clothes. I thought nothing of it, but less than a minute later, she came out of her room with a basket of clothes. Confused, I looked at her. I asked if she'd just been in my bathroom. She shook her head. She'd been in her bathroom, and that made my heart skip a beat. I told her what happened, but she only repeated that she was in her bathroom. I just stared at her in confusion, stayed awake the rest of the night. I wasn't able to fall asleep until after 6 this morning. On Sunday, July 18th, 2021, Mom and I were in the backyard testing out my brand new telescope. It was the first clear night since I bought it, and after setting it up, I was finally able to admire the glorious details of the moon's bright surface. I called Mom over to look through the small lens, but she wanted to see Jupiter. I told her that that might take a while, since I was still trying to figure out how the telescope worked. And while readjusting the tripod, a weird feeling came over me. I felt like I was being stared at, almost as if someone's eyes were literally burning into the back of your head. My instincts said to turn around, and that's when I saw a huge, glowing orange orb just sitting in the sky, roughly a block away from my house. As I stood frozen in disbelief, my mind tried to convince me that it was only a plane or helicopter. But all logical reasoning fled when the orb began moving in a bizarre, zigzagging motion. Also, just to clarify, this all transpired within 10 seconds or less. The exact moment I turned my head, it became frightened because I noticed it watching me. It freaked out, and within seconds, it shot away, gone without a sound. If I'd blinked, I probably would have missed the whole thing. I was so confused. I started to panic. I couldn't believe what I'd just witnessed. I still have so many questions. What was that? Why was it watching me? If it was extraterrestrial beings, what were they planning to do? This experience gives me chills every time I think about it, but it also makes me very curious. My grandmother passed away when I was 5. When she died, she told my siblings and I that she would leave us dimes and pennies. I didn't understand what she meant. I was only a child. But then I began randomly finding dimes around my room. Thinking nothing of it, I simply picked them up and went about my business. That is, until one day I was pissed off at my parents. I can't remember why. I must have been 7 or 8. I was laying on the living room floor, cursing as quietly as possible to avoid further trouble, when a dime fell out of thin air, hit me on the forehead. I sat up thinking my brother was messing with me, but no one was around. It freaked me out, so I went to my room and tried not to think about it too much. It started happening more and more, but only when I was angry. My grandmother was always good at calming me down. I thought I was crazy until I was pissed off while with a friend. She heard the dime fall, and it shook her. I don't know how to explain it, if that's even possible, but I'm convinced my grandmother leaves me dimes. I don't have any other explanation. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode, but don't miss a brand new one every Friday night, and my other weekly uploads every Sunday and Wednesday. Appreciate it if you would all like this video, and of course, talk to me in the comments. I want to thank those who shared their stories, and a big thanks to all of you for listening. Huge shout out to all of my patrons, whom I appreciate so very much. Tracy S., Monica L., ZOEWATT, Shelly B., Donald C., Rat Girl, ALISHA S., ERIN G., NIKKI H., Mr. Revenant, Naz K., and the Darkest Hour's newest patron, BRENDON G. If you want to support the Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining my Patreon. Check out patreon.com/thedarkesthour or click the link in the description to learn more. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, the Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.